I think we're going to get started. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're going to get started. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's on. We'll have to project. There we go. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We are here to commemorate the 2-year anniversary of the historic protests in Cuba. So on behalf of the members of Congress, members of the Cuba Democracy Caucus, on behalf of the Foundation for Human Rights in Cuba, prisoners' defenders, victims of communism, Cuba Decide, Center for a Free Cuba, Cuba Resistance, Outreach Aid for the Americas, and the Cuban American National Foundation. My name is Jose Cardenas, and I am going to MC this event. The way it will work is that we're expecting members of Congress within their schedules to stop by and say a few remarks in commemoration of the historic events from 2 years ago. When we will also have some of the representatives of the groups speak, and the way it will work again is that if a member shows up in the middle of some remarks, we will kindly ask our speaker to pause so that the members can come in and out. This is part of a number of events over the past 48 hours in recognition of what occurred in Cuba 2 years ago. It was as everybody knows who witnessed this on television, is just an extraordinary outburst, spontaneous outburst of pent-up frustration, anger, and simply just a resilience and a courage to finally stand up and face their oppressors, to demand fundamental change in Cuba. Yesterday in Miami, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee hosted a roundtable. Today, both the Senate and the House have introduced resolutions, bipartisan, bicameral resolutions in recognition of the need to remain vigilant for human rights, to defend human rights in Cuba. And also, Secretary of State Antony Blinken also released a statement today, again noting the moment and the history of what occurred 2 years ago. And what we intend to get out of this recognition is not only to continue monitoring the situation in Cuba, because the regime has responded to the pent-up grievances of the Cuban people in the only way they know how, and that is further repression. That is all they know. That is all they can do. And so the responsibility of the international community to keep the vigilance up on what's happening in Cuba is absolutely essential. And so what we want to do today, again, is to highlight, again, the need for international monitoring, the international vigilance, and also to talk a little bit about what exactly happened that day 2 years ago. And it continues to show itself in spurts in other places on the island on an almost daily basis. An unwillingness to accept any more, without question, the dictates of this unrepentant regime that refuses any relief, to afford any relief for the Cuban people. And that, by way of brief remarks, I wanted to now to turn to Tony Costa, who is the president of the Foundation for Human Rights in Cuba, who is going to say a few words. Tony?
Thank you very much, and welcome all of you for being here today. We really appreciate that, and having so many of the organizations that are defending the cause of the Free Cuba to be present here with us. I'd like to start by reflecting a little bit about what July 11 represents in the struggle for a free Cuba. I think that it's let's see if everybody comes in. Thank you. Sit down. It's important for us to reflect and think what July 11 represents. And I think to me, what it represents is a lot of frustration, anger, and every type of resentment against the government that has suppressed the Cuban people for a very, very, very long time. I see a lot of young faces that cannot remember everything that I lived through in Cuba through my early years of my life. But to know how long the suffering of the Cuban people is going on is very telling of what the solutions need to be and how quickly we need them. So it's important to understand that the people who came out on July 11 were asking mainly for freedom. There's a lot of necessities in Cuba: water, food, medicines, electricity, and so forth. But the important thing that they asked for, in my opinion, and the one that was more prevalent, was freedom. Because living without freedom is living an empty life, in my opinion, and a life of too much sacrifice to really happen to anybody. So what was the government response to that? Repression, repression, and more repression. People in jail. We have over 30 child in jail just for going out and asking for freedom. I mean, that's ludicrous to think that a government can put children of that age that were not violent or anything like that, and because they want freedom for the country, they have been put in jail for many years. This is an atrocity. It's an atrocity with all of the ones or the other nearly 1,000 that are in jail. But to have children of that age separated from the parents and put in jail is a crime that has no parallel, in my opinion. And that's the nature of the Cuban government. We need to keep that in mind as we go forward and develop strategies and policies to deal with the monster that we have in Cuba. So the government response, in addition to the repression, they took all the internet out, so that the protesters could not communicate among themselves. And so we need to ask ourselves, well, why did the explosion happen? Why did July 11 happen? You got to think that after 64 years of dictatorship, uh, without freedom, without rule of law, without human rights, respect for human rights, and what are the people to do? You know, that anger and that frustration accumulated. And one day it came to a point where they got together and they came out in masses. I mean, this is probably the largest protest in Cuba history. So that's why July 11 happened. And that's why we need to keep the spirit and the efforts of July 11 alive. We need to keep it, and because it's continuing, not at the level that happened in July 11, but it's happening throughout Cuba in different communities at different levels. So it is important that Cuban people know that we are here, that we are with them, and that we're doing everything possible to bring about change in Cuba. And so we understand the process in Cuba a little bit, if I may. But Cuba was one of the top countries economically, politically, and so forth in the 1959. And today is one of the lowest. So think about it. What did the revolution bring us? Take us from top of the economic level of standard of living to the bottom. Why do they do this? It's simple. Control. Control. They're not interested in the well-being of the population. Their interest is to control. In order to control, they confiscated the whole properties in Cuba in the 60s. And that's something we have to keep in mind, that when we think about the embargo. And I don't want to talk about the embargo, but the reason for the embargo is that Cuba confiscated all the properties without compensation. Hello? So that's, if they wanted no embargo, they could have compensated the owners and they would have no embargo. So it's up to them. And you must realize, if we lived in the embargo, the message that we send to the world is that any country that confiscate American properties, it's okay, nothing happens. That would be terrible, in my opinion. So what has Cuba done since they had no way? They centralized the economy. And we know what happens in a centralized economy, that the government controls everything, decides all what's to be produced, what's the price to be paid, and so forth. The productions went to hell. So they, being bright as we Cubans are, they say, what do we have to export? Human beings. So number one business for Cuba today is human trafficking. Cuba is one of the two most, with more human trafficking in the world, North Korea and Cuba. Those two have el galardón, se ganaron el premio en human trafficking. And this is ludicrous, but if you start to think about it, there are 55 countries today that are employing doctors from Cuba under human trafficking conditions. Hello? And what are we doing? What's the world doing? They're doing like the three little monkeys. I don't hear nothing, I don't see nothing, and I don't say nothing. That's not us. We're here to see, to hear, and to do something about it. And that's why we're here today, because we want the protest of July 11th to continue at a bigger scale and in all the important places in the world that make decisions about policies to Cuba. That's why we're here today. So, let me not get. So, since Cuba did not put emphasis on the production, I went to the human trafficking undertaking. The number one was the doctors, as I said, and that's the number one. If you take the data from the Cuban government, not ours, you see it. They say from professional services, they call them. And that's the number one income for Cuba. And so the second, there's also another one internally. We know that there are a number of chains of hotels from Spain with hotels in Cuba. Guess what? Hotels in Cuba, foreign hotels in Cuba cannot hire their employees directly. They have to go through a government company that has the peculiarity of also keeping 90% of the salary that the Spaniards, the French, and so forced the hotels pay for the employees. That's another way of slave work or human trafficking. And we're not going to tolerate that anymore. That has to change. And I'm glad we have a Spaniard here, my friend, that it's going to help us bring a change on that setup, in human setup. The other thing is they're now bringing foreign investors. Really? Foreign investors. It's incredible. And they give them all the benefits that none of the Cubans have to invest. Really. So Cuba is out for sale to the highest bidder. And what are we going to do about it? We're going to sit and take it? No. We're going to raise hell about it. And we're going to say Cuba, we're not going to tolerate that. And we're going to make sure that Cuba is put to shame for doing those things. What am I saying here? And then we ask, we need to and when we ask ourselves, why did July 11 happen? Well, these are the reasons July 11 happened. All this frustration, all this make people one day explode. And when they find a bomb, they do. And that's what happened. And because humans seek freedom, even if they don't fully understand what freedom is. That's a natural instinct. And freedom is because it's a natural state for the human race. And so nothing is going to stop the protest of the July 11th or the efforts that we're carrying outside Cuba and inside Cuba, helping the opposition until we get a free and democratic Cuba. And I want that message to carry loud and loud to the rest of the world and to the Cuban dictators. Cuba is going to be free. It's going to be free by the efforts of the Cuban inside the island and outside. And we're here to say, we're with you until the end. Bye.
Thank you, Tony. I've already violated my own conditions at the beginning. I missed Congressman Mooney walking in. Congressman, we'd love to have you say a few words. A son of Cuba.
Thank you. I'll just be really brief. For those who don't know me, my name is Alex Mooney. I represent West Virginia's 2nd Congressional District. I'm in my 9th year. My mother, Lala, she goes by Lala, her legal name is Eulalia Suarez, who spent her first 19 years in Cuba and fled, of course, to America to live in freedom. My mother's one of 14 kids. Perhaps you know my uncle Xavier Suarez or my cousin Francis. But we're here just to say we support freedom for the people of Cuba. We're watching and we know what's going on. A lot of Americans, frankly, take that for granted. They don't realize many countries around the world completely oppress those who want basic human rights. Actually, coming here today, there's some protesters out there protesting this gathering. Do they understand in Cuba they'd be put in jail for doing that? I mean, the irony of it. They should be protesting what's happening in Cuba, not us having a meeting. It's ridiculous. So, free speech, elections, frankly, even the free flow of information just the free flow of information for the people of Cuba to understand the truth and see what's happening around the world in this country, in their own country. You have a government completely trying to lock down on that. So we do have opportunities in this country and around the world. You mentioned Spain, other places, to help inspire the people. Change has to come from within. We understand that for peaceful, for peaceful change from within the country. So they have basic rights. So really just here to say we're going to continue to support the peaceful efforts for democratic reforms. And it's a pleasure to be with you here briefly today. God bless.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman. And words well taken about our friends outside. Now we'll turn it over to representative of Prisoners Defenders, a Madrid-based group that has been really at the forefront of so much of the work in Europe and elsewhere in terms of promoting basic human rights in Cuba, as well as many other countries. Without any further delay, I'll turn it over to Javier Garrondo.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. Before July 11th, 2021, Cuba had about 140 political prisoners. They were usually journalists, intellectuals, and activists. In addition, more than 11,000 people in Cuba were condemned from 1 to 4 years for criminal sentences without a crime, because the Cuban Penal Code in force until December 1, 2021 said that they were observed to have a behavior contrary to socialist morality. So they were prone to commit a crime in the future. 11,000 people condemned. There are more today than 90,000 prisoners, inmates in Cuba's jails. Another 37,000 are condemned to house arrest and forced labor without internment. It is the largest prison overcrowding per capita in the world. The situation seemed like it could not get any worse, but it did from July 11th, 2021, when in the streets of more than 50 cities in Cuba, tens of thousands of citizens raised their voices with peaceful slogans such as Patria y Vida, Homeland and Life, or Libertad, freedom. The president of Cuba went on television and told citizens to take on the streets to combat the counter-revolutionaries. He sent brother against brother. However, the true and only revolutionaries were those who were in the streets demanding freedom. Do you think that at Diaz-Canel's call, the people came out to fight against their peers? The answer is no. It was just a prepared choreography. The special forces, the army dressed up as civilians, were put in buses supplied with baseball bats, metal bars, and guns, and beat and even shoot the peaceful demonstrators. At the same time, the regime took the opportunity to go to the homes of all human rights activists and raid the entire country in the following days. Between 5,000 and 8,000 people were arrested in a few days, and around 2,000 of them were criminally prosecuted, including 150 women and more than 50 children, including those under the age of 16. Cuba is the third country in the world by number of United Nations urgent actions on enforced disappearances, and it is in 2021, it is the first one and surpassed Mexico and Iraq. At this moment, we still have 1,047 people condemned in violation of all international legality and due process. Still in prison are 116 women, 35 children, condemned 35 children. Most of them are in house arrest and forced labor without internment. In its last report, the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child has certified that at least 410 minors are imprisoned in Cuba, of whom 260 are 16 or 17 years old, but 150 are 15 years old or younger. And there are no re-education centers in Cuba. They are prisons for minors with cells and regimes similar to those of adults. In response, Cuba even acknowledged that 39 minors and 60 from 16 and 17 years old were prosecuted and condemned of this protest. Many more minors, much more, were detained those days. More than 200 July 11th prisoners have been sentenced for sedition, including many of those minors, 17 of them, with average sentences of 10 years. More than 100 of the 1,047 civilians, in addition, condemned, in addition, have been tried by military courts in Cuba. The sentences of imprisonment are, in most cases, higher than 5 years. But for asking for freedom, some of the sentences imposed in first instance were up to 30 years. A few weeks ago, we presented the first comprehensive report on torture in Cuba. 250 testimonies certified 181 cases of torture, among which we verified torture of minors, women. Minors are one of the groups with the highest number and intensity of tortures. One degree of evil is a system that imprisons people because of their thoughts. Another, quite different, much more grave, if it is possible to have that level, is to know that all political prisoners, more than 1,000, are tortured mercilessly, viciously, causing irreversible damage to them, their children, and their families. On July 11, citizens, their children, married couples, entire families took to the streets, and entire families are now in prison being tortured. At home, the families who support these prisoners are persecuted, detained, expelled from their jobs, and all of them threaten that if they speak out, the repression on their family member in prison will even be much worse. The repression is not conjunctural, is not peremptory, it is not occasional, it is structural. We have been studying this issue for many years. It is structural in terms of the criminal process and its legislation, the praxis, the impunity of the repressors, and it is clear in the very definition, even of the Constitution. Reverend evangelists like are tortured in prison, like Pastor Lorenzo Rosales Fajardo, who has been beaten so badly that he fainted. But do you know how the repressive police woke him up? They urinated on him. There are priests of the Afro-Cuban religion, like Loreto Hernandez and his wife, who are being tortured without mercy. There are 2 trans women in men's prison of maximum rigor, where they are being raped and mistreated on a daily basis. There are homosexuals tortured for their sexual identity and their identity of thought. For both, one of them was brought to his trial forcibly dressed in pink clothes, to the derision of all the prison officials and the whole court. Can you believe that? Can you believe human beings being so cruel? Yes, some human beings do these things. We know it. We know it since Auschwitz, since a long time ago. Among the tortures of the minors, you can see that 100 of them, of all minors examined, suffer humiliation, degradation, and verbal abuse. 100 of them, deprivation of communication with their family, defense, and relatives. 100 of them, intentional sleep deprivation. 100 of them, fluid and or food deprivation. Medical care, 0%. Forced labor, 100%. It is crazy to read this on minors, tortures on minors. But on young people, you see that 81% of them are suffering humiliation, degradation, verbal abuse. 72% of them, deprivation of communication with the family. Physical aggressions, 72% of them. Solitary punishment, confinements, 72% of them. These are the young. And the women women are treated in a very special way because they are being deprived of communication with their family. They are suffering harassment and threats to their family members. Women are having a bad time in the Cuba's prisons. I have a list of victims here, but I can name them all. But I want to make a special mention to a unique person, Jose Daniel Ferrer. The regime is killing him. The regime is killing him. He has been in a punishment cell incommunicado except for rare occasions since his arrest 2 years ago. Half naked, they beat him, insult him, mistreat him and his family. He's subject to sonic torture daily basis. His skin is full of eczema all over due to severe degradation of the immune system. A few weeks ago, he was taken to have a badly infected tooth removed. The doctor removed the good one and left the bad one in, and they laughed at him, saying, all this could be over if you accept to leave the country. And he said, I'll be dying for my people. We cannot let one of the greatest leaders of the 21st century, for the defense of humanity and human rights, die or be incapacitated at the hands of these captors. We cannot let it happen. Europe and the United Nations, together with a bloc of democratic countries of the world, must put a stop to the barbarities occurring in Cuba. There is no other option among democratic countries but to oppose head-on the crimes against humanity that are committed every day, every week, every year in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, in Bolivia. The metastasis of this cancer personified by the Cuban regime has been terrible in Latin America. There will be no peace, human rights, and tranquility in Latin America until Cuba is a democracy. And there will be no democracy in Cuba as a product of transition with this regime. This regime is defined and created, like the Third Reich, to last 1,000 years if necessary. It parasitized the Soviet Union, it parasitized Venezuela. Now it wants to parasitize Russia. And with no doubt, it will do everything possible to parasitize Mexico and Brazil as much as possible. The Cuban regime is a threat to its people, yes, but we must be aware that it is also a threat to the rest of the world. What would the world be today if, as Fidel Castro asked Khrushchev, as documented by numerous sources, the Soviet Union had launched the atomic missiles against the United States? There can be no peaceful world as long as there are human beings subjected to these barbarities. The duty of free human beings is to liberate all others. Patria y vida, thank you very much.
You know, you can fill a library with the numbers of memoirs and books written by dissidents and those who fought during the Cold War against these types of regimes. But one of the constants there is that they were kept going because they knew that their names were being mentioned abroad. And I want to thank Javier especially for naming names so that these people know that what they're enduring, what they're suffering is not going unnoticed. I would also like to say that switching gears, one of the great strengths of our movement for free and democratic Cuba is its bipartisanship. And up here on Capitol Hill, amongst not a lot of bipartisan issues, the issue of Cuba has freedom for Cuba has extensive support on both sides of the aisle, and we are very grateful. And we always, those of us who work in this vineyard, always seek to maintain that and go out of our way to broaden the support on both sides of the aisle. So with that, I want to ask Congressman Soto from Florida.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here today. Your familia Boricua, our hearts break for you all, and we also stand with you. When I hear from constituents about their stories, because the stories really drive home the experiences of our former mayor, Jose Alvarez, who's now the regional HUD director for the Southeast, was born in Cuba, and he was over for Independence Day. We were watching the fireworks in Kissimmee, and he talked about growing up until 6, 7 years of age, and then having to flee with his family. He talked about before they left that the Castro regime would come around and count how many chickens they had to determine how many eggs they had to produce. And if a chicken died, they had to have the bones so that they knew that they didn't eat them, down to a single chicken. We're talking about the kind of repressiveness. And of course, his family left. They left and went to Spain for a year. And then it was a great relief for his, as he was recounting this just a few days ago to me, to be able to come to the United States. Some of his family had been able to claim asylum through some of the various embassies, including in Brazil, and made it their way to the United States. And his father, at 89 years old, still has a major farm down in Miami near the Doral area that he works to this day. And that is, the type of lifestyle, the type of freedom they lost down there. We also have folks like Tony Ray, who's an amazing developer and builder in our district, who does a lot of good in the community. And he was a teenager, and him and his brother took apart their barn to make a skiff to cross the Florida Straits. I could not imagine as a teenager taking half of a barn and going across one of the most dangerous water bodies where the Caribbean Sea and the Atlantic come together, an area that has claimed so many Cuban lives far too soon. And of course, like with the Alvarez family, the Ray family came to the mainland and has done amazing work creating one of the most productive local developers in Central Florida. And he continues to be a great advisor to us to this day. And on July 11th, 2 years ago, a lot of us saw the younger next generation of Cubans stand up. And of course, we stood in solidarity with them throughout Florida. I see my colleague, Representative Jimenez here. It's great to see you, sir. In Miami and Tampa, and of course, also in Orlando. We work with a lot of folks on both sides of the aisle on these issues. Senator Menendez and Representative Diaz-Balart and some of our newer colleagues as well for multiple years. And we look to them a lot to help with how to make sure we're not propping up the regime now through doing business because we know it's going to go right to the Communist Party, right down there. One area that I'm looking forward to continue to work on is in the telecommunications area. We saw during the July 11th protests that it was communication between young people through cell phones, through internet access, that a lot of these protests arose. And then what happened? The regime throttled that communication. People felt alone, isolated throughout the island. They were picked apart, divided. But technology has evolved. I work very closely with SpaceX in Central Florida, and they're evolving satellite internet with a small box and a small satellite that can be as close to on the ground to provide internet to places like Cuba, Venezuela, and other areas that are under tyrannical dictators. And so it's something that I've talked to some of our colleagues about that I'd like to pursue further, but communication is essential for any revolt, for any revolution, overthrow the communist regime down there. People need to know that they're not alone, not only through radio, but also through the internet. And it's going to be this next generation of Cubans that have to know they're not alone, that they could stand together, that they could communicate together and stand up like they did on July 11th. The only thing that is so sad is we have not seen a lot of progress since then. Our work together, unfortunately, is as tough as it was back then as it is today. And so these and other areas like humanitarian assistance and other areas, I'm standing in solidarity with you all, and I appreciate you having me. Welcome to Washington. We appreciate all of you.
Thank you, Congressman Soto. On the subject of Cuban American success stories, another great strength of this movement are those Cuban Americans who have taken advantage of the great opportunities our country has offered to engage politically and to come here to Washington to bring the voice of the community to the halls of Congress, to their colleagues, because when you have the family background, it brings such more of a powerful message than obviously reading about it in a newspaper or any other media. So with that, I'd like to introduce Congressman Jimenez from Miami.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I'm a little late. My wife and I, who's in the beautiful wife Lourdes, who's here with me, we just got off a plane from congressional delegation that went down to Brazil, Colombia, and Panama. And while we have a lot of Cuban Americans in Congress, I think I'm the only one actually born there. So I was born in Cuba. I didn't come in here until I was almost 7 years old. And I know firsthand what the communist regime does to young people. The reason I'm here is my father asked me one day, actually I asked my father, I said, hey, if Russia and the United States ever got into a war, who would win? And then my father said, well, you know, there's good guys and there's bad guys, and you see it on TV and all that, and the Americans are the good people, and so America will win. And I said, no, the Russians will win because they're more powerful. So he asked me, where did you hear that? Where did you learn that? Well, I learned it in school. I was being indoctrinated at 6 years old. And he says, oh, you learned that in school. Oh, very good. A month later, we're out of there. And so that's what they do to you. And so I know that firsthand. And so that's why, you know, any kind of indoctrination in school for any political purposes, I'm completely against, because I was on the receiving end of that firsthand. I used to wear a little red and black armband. They used to make you wear that. They used to have a little book where you put stamps of the revolution, all the great things the revolution was doing. And so they indoctrinate you, and they keep on indoctrinating you. There's stories that say, close your eyes, to little kids. They're in a classroom. Close your eyes. Ask God for ice cream. Open your eyes. No ice cream. Close your eyes again. Ask Castro for ice cream. Ice cream. So that's what they do. All right. And so on 11th, you know, this is the anniversary of the 11th of July. And a couple of years ago, the people of Cuba rose up spontaneously throughout the island. And they asked for one thing. They weren't asking for remittances. They weren't asking for vaccines. They weren't asking for the end of the embargo. They were asking for one thing. Libertad. Freedom. And frankly, the United States should be the champion of freedom in our hemisphere. We shouldn't tolerate communism or any type of dictatorship here in our hemisphere. And hopefully, you know, we get to the point one day that we will be the champion of freedom, and that the people of America will look to people of the Americas will look to the United States as the champion of their freedom. Because every day that we don't do that, we are allowing dictatorships, regimes to oppress their people, to oppress their freedom. No freedom of the press, no freedom of religion, no freedom of speech. And we shouldn't tolerate that in our hemisphere. And we need to take more action than we take. You know, we say a lot of words and wow, hey, we're against it and all that. But you know what? It's been over 60 years. My parents, and I'm sure that Lourdes' parents, my wife's parents, or many of the people here, never thought It takes 60 years and maybe longer, because we're going on 60-something years now, for this regime to fail. My father thought it was going to be about 6 months, and then I'll be back, because that's what happened in Cuba. You had this thing, a year later, 2 years later, it would fall. You'd have somebody else. Well, this has been going on for over 60 years. And you got to give it to the Cuban regime. It's very resilient. They're smart. And they're really smart at oppressing their people. So I share my colleagues from Orlando's views about communication. And there is technology coming. And I've spoken to companies, not just SpaceX, but other companies that have technology that we can use to allow the Cuban people to communicate with themselves. Because I think that is the key. That's the first key. Allow the Cuban people to communicate with themselves freely so that the Cuban government can't shut it down. And also that the Cuban government can't monitor it, so that the people of Cuba can talk amongst themselves and have more spontaneous demonstrations like we had on July 11th, and more, and eventually lead to the freedom, because it has to come from the inside. We have to help, but it has to come from the inside. And so there is light at the end of this tunnel. And I've seen it. It's not just SpaceX. There's another company based out of Miami, actually, that is run by a Venezuelan who wants the same thing for his country, and for Iran, and for Russia, and for China, so that the people of those countries that are being oppressed can actually speak to themselves and show the rest of the world what's going on in their country. And also, we need to pressure our allies. They're allies, but so-called allies that are allowing through business and allowing business interests to keep these regimes in power. And so you're oppressing the people. Yeah, you're making $1 or a pound or a franc or whatever, but your actions are leading to the oppression of millions of people. And we need to lead the way. We need to show that. So again, I've had a long career in different places, but there's a reason why I'm here. Not that I'm destiny, but there's a reason why I'm here. All right. And the reason why I'm here is to, lend another voice to the cause of freedom in our hemisphere. And I would hope that during my time here, I'm able to go back home. I haven't seen my home in 60, I don't want to date myself, 62 years. I haven't seen my home in 62 years. And actually, the older I get, the more I want to see my home. I want to see where I was born. I want to see, the ranch that my dad had. I want to see the school that I went to. Right now, it's a wreck. The place I live, that's also a wreck, by the way, because I've seen pictures of it. But I want to see the land of my birth. Listen, I'm an American. But I have Cuban roots. I was born in Cuba. And so the older I get, the more I want to see where my roots come from. And I also want to be part of rebuilding Cuba. I'm not going to go back to Cuba. My life is here. My children are here. My grandchildren are here. But I still have a love for my country of birth. And I have a love for my people, the Cuban people. They deserve to live in freedom. They deserve to live in freedom because they live in this hemisphere, and that should be our destiny and our right. It should be the rights of all people around the world, but at least in this hemisphere. And so, with that, I'll leave it to that, and know that you will always have a friend, in me and my family, and that we're focused on the cause of freedom for Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and any other regime that may pop up anywhere around the world. So thank you. God bless you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman. We have a special treat. Senator Rick Scott from Florida made the journey all the way from the other side of Capitol Hill, and we are very grateful. All right.
Well, first off, it's great to be here. It's great to see Lourdes. So
25 years ago, or no, a little bit more than that now. I'm aging myself also, like Carlos. I started buying hospitals, and my second market was Miami. And every hospital I purchased was a Spanish-speaking hospital. And what was impressive was there were so many doctors there that had been in prison in Cuba. And I remember Pepe Landis. And I think like 8 years. It's hard to believe that, and he didn't come out. He didn't come out scarred from the standpoint that he was a mad person. He came out wanting to make good change. They had adopted this country. They become like Congressman Jimenez, American citizens, but they did care about their homeland. And then I got elected governor. I got to do all sorts of things with people from Latin America that had come here and had lived our dream. They had families back home. They were worried about what's going back home in Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and other places that at times had a very difficult time. And we were able to do a lot of things here. But your heart goes out. You can't believe this is happening to people in our anywhere in the world, but for sure our hemisphere. A little bit. So I have so our jobs up here, we have great titles and all those things, but the truth is everything we do is through people that have a passion about something. And Tony has a passion about making sure that we get freedom and liberty back in Cuba. And I think he wakes up every day and says, what can Rick Scott do? Or Paul Bonicelli, my national security advisor, what can we do to get rid of the Castro regime? And let me just give an example of something I wouldn't have known but for Tony. And Tony, you might correct this, might be off a little bit, but in the European Union, any one country can prevent them from doing a trade deal with another country. So the European Union was completely committed to doing something with Cuba. And little Lithuania, 3 million people, who all of us have probably heard of it, but have no idea where it is. Little Lithuania was standing firm. They've been overrun by the Soviet Union years past, and they actually really believed in freedom. And they were fighting for freedom in Cuba. They were fighting to make sure Taiwan stays free. But if it wasn't for what Tony told me about, and the fact that a lot of us were out, we went and supported them. I went and visited them. And to this day, the European Union hasn't done a trade deal with Cuba. I can tell you though, when I've been over there, the Europeans have no idea, because they all take vacations there, not all of them, but a lot of them take vacations there. They have no idea the atrocities that are going on. So I think what we're doing today and what we have to do every day is really talk about the problems that are happening there. You have to really admire the protesters that 2 years ago went and put their lives at risk, are arrested, some as young as 14 years old, that don't have opportunity now because they stood up for freedom and liberty. So I think we have to do everything we can to keep this at the forefront, to keep the top of the fold in the newspapers, to talk about what's going on, because the only way we're going to get there is we do that, and then we do exactly what Carlos Jimenez said. We've got to get them the internet. We've got to get it liberty, not just in Cuba, but in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and any other country. So there's a lot of wonderful people up here that really care about this. But I want to especially thank Tony Costa for getting up each and every day and making sure that we all do something to try to move the cause for freedom ahead. And if we do, it makes us safer. But the most important thing is think what we do for the families down there that don't have an opportunity that we've all had. I mean, we had a country that you could come to. If we lose it here, where we're going to go. I just did something recently. I put up not come because you're not going to be very welcome. And my point is, if you come to Miami and you start pushing socialism and communism, you're not going to be very welcome. Maybe there'll be some places they don't know enough about it, but if you come to a lot of parts of our state, people have lived it, and their families have lived it. I mean, and you look at every place in Latin America where they've had problems, they come to Miami. We get the best and the brightest of all Latin America into Florida, especially into Miami. That's why Miami is the vibrant place. So thank you for highlighting what. Hope at some point we're able to see freedom and liberty there. It'll be nice if the people that were born there can go back, because we all want to make our homelands a better place.
Thank you so much, Senator. As I said before, we are very blessed to have so many Cuban Americans here in Washington who have, as I said, engaged politically, have earned their right to represent their constituencies here in Washington, and yet at the same time be able to communicate to their colleagues that personal sense of the tragedy that has affected their families. Very lucky to have Congresswoman Malliotakis, and we'd love her to come up and say a few words.
It's good to be with all of you. My name is Nicole Malliotakis. Mi nombre es griega, pero mi mamá es cubana. So many people don't know that, but they've learned that over the last couple of years as I've worked with my colleagues, Congressman Jimenez, Congresswoman Salazar, and Mario Diaz-Balart, and others on these very important issues. I thank you all for gathering here today, and I think it's very important that you're here not just today, but throughout the year, and not just here at the Capitol, but at the White House, at the State Department, at other areas and entities in our federal government, to make it known that the Cuban community is very vocal, that we're very persistent, that we're very passionate about this particular issue of bringing freedom to the people of Cuba. Today happens to be my grandmother's birthday. My grandmother passed away July 11th when those protests, it felt to me like it was something that was, my grandmother was watching over the people of Cuba, and she was calling for the from heaven, watching over them. And I really thought this was going to be it. This was going to be it. But sadly, we had an administration in place that just didn't seize upon the opportunity to take the decisive action necessary. And it was so frustrating for us as members of Congress. And I said, this is also going to be it, because there's a reason why Carlos, Maria, and I were elected to Congress, and we're here at this very moment. So it was very disappointing to see that the administration did not take the actions that we were encouraging, whether that be providing the internet access to make sure these displays, these protests were getting out in the internet to show how young people, little children, were being beaten, jailed, and abused, and how the protesters weren't having their right to freedom. And it's heartbreaking to me, because in many ways we know what happens, because I still have family there. I don't know how many of you still have family in Cuba, but I know firsthand the atrocities that are happening. There's dual currency, the way that they are abused and just treated as slaves. Even young military, they turn 18, they're put in the military, they're paid $15 a month if they're lucky, okay? And here in the United States, you have Bernie Sanders, you have all these people talking about socialism and communism and, oh, we want $15 an hour, the fight for 15, and yet that they stand with a communist country that pays its people $15 a month. So there's a real hypocrisy in what they are advocating for in many ways, and the lack of action that they've taken on this particular issue. Now it's becoming even more troublesome. We've known that Russia and China have always worked in collaboration with Cuba against U.S. interests. We find out now that there's an additional spy base that's going on Cuban soil 90 miles from our shores, and now it is China that's doing it. And it's disconcerting that we don't hear anything from this administration. And during those protests, we really didn't hear anything either. And so not even, forget about the internet, how about just coming out and saying that what's happening in Cuba is wrong, and that these people deserve to have freedom. They deserve to be able to elect their own government. They deserve to be paid and treated with dignity. They deserve to have human rights. How about just doing that? It's been, unfortunately, very difficult for us to see the lack of action taken from this administration. So it is important that you're here today. It is important that you're hearing from us who support your cause and support the Cuban people. But it's important, more important for you to talk to those who are not as like-minded, because they need to be educated about what is going on in this country that is 90 miles from our shore, the threats for international security that are real as a result of their partnerships with Russia and Cuba, and that they, abuse their people, whether it be at the protests, whether it be through treating them as slaves, whether it be through these human rights violations. So thank you very much for being here, but let's get out there and talk to others about what is happening and the atrocities that we cannot show because they don't have the internet access that they need, that we cannot show because they're afraid now to go protest further because they're afraid of being jailed because they've seen their friends being jailed. And let's show what's happening to the young children in Cuba who are being abused and jailed and separated from their families if they just peacefully protest or do anything that's, we would consider a right here in the United States of America. Thank you and God bless.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. We're going to keep going here so we can finish on time. We're very fortunate also to welcome Congressman Rob Menendez from New Jersey, who is, we welcome him as a new freedom fighter here on Capitol Hill for not only freedom in Cuba, but elsewhere, as Congressman Jimenez mentioned. Congressman Jimenez.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today, not just today, but for those who have longed for a free and democratic Cuba, people who have given their careers to this cause. Thank you for all the work that you do. Thank you for your advocacy, constant advocacy, and making sure that people don't forget what's happening on the island, not just on anniversaries, but every single day that it continues to be strangled by this regime. For me personally, my grandparents left Cuba always thinking that they were going to go back. And they made that decision when they had 2 young kids. My family is here this week. I have 2 young children. And they came to Florida thinking that they were going to wait out Batista and then have the opportunity to go back, and they never did. And they started all over again here in the United States, went from Florida to New York, eventually to New Jersey. And that's where my father and his 2 siblings grew up. And I constantly think about what that must be like to have a homeland that you never got to go back to have memories of a place that you never got to see again. And for me, my paternal grandmother passed several years ago. My father never got to go back to her homeland with her. And I think about having the opportunity to go with my father and his grandchildren to a free and democratic Cuba. And for me, that's what keeps me thinking about this, working towards the end to create a Cuba that is finally free and democratic again. And 2 years ago, we saw that there continues and there forever will be an appetite on the country to have that future for itself. And we are obligated here as legislators to make sure that we continue to work and drive towards that destination, because for all of us, for so many of us, for this hemisphere, having a free and democratic Cuba is the only future that the island deserves. But for people that have been in this fight for decades, it feels like a destination that keeps moving farther and farther away. Doesn't mean we ever give up. Doesn't mean for 1 second that we will ever give up. The work continues until we have that Cuba, because that's what Cuba deserves. And so I think about what happened 2 years ago, and it was this incredible spark. Spark hasn't faded. That spark continues to exist, and we just need to continue to grow it and grow it and grow it. So that becomes the message, that becomes the inevitable future for Cuba. And that's the work that Carlos, myself, Tony, my father, so many have dedicated ourselves to. So when I decided to run for Congress last year, I realized there's so much work here domestically, but also in terms of places like Cuba, that the work's not done yet. Until it is, none of us can ever give up on the work. That's why I've committed myself to. That's the work I think about every single day on every single issue that we have to face, is creating free, democratic countries across the globe, but specifically with respect to Cuba. So that way, one day, my father, myself, his grandchildren can all go there together and finally have that opportunity, which so many families here in the United States deserve. So thank you for all that you do. Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to continuing to support with you.
Thank you, Congressman. And now, it's my particular honor to introduce to you one of my heroines in the cause for a free Cuba. She has traveled the world and has become probably one of the most visible and effective voices to educate audiences on the reality. And we grieve that she had to pay so terrible a price for her advocacy. But what she has done and the time that she has spent and what she has given of her life in the last 10 years has been nothing short of remarkable. And with that, I will introduce Rosa Maria Paya.
Thank you very much for those words, Jose. And thank you very much to all the members of Congress. Congressman Jimenez, thank you so much for your friendship and for being here with the Cuban people today. Thank you, Tony and FHRC, for organizing this so important, so much needed gathering to educate, but also to call to action to the American government and to the American people. It's about time that we realize that defending human rights, defending democracy in Cuba is defending human rights and democracy in the US. It's actually defending democratic stability in our hemisphere and in the rest of the world. I know that we are in the Congress of the United States, so we should speak English. But I also know that the Cuban regime is filming, and they are probably going to use some of the images here, and they're going to try to twist what we are saying, and they are going to try to portray us as puppets of the imperialism. So I will very briefly will shift to Spanish. Y quiero hablarle a todos los cubanos y a todos los latinoamericanos que están sufriendo también la dictadura cubana. En el aniversario número 2 de el 11 de julio, que marca un antes y un después para el pueblo cubano, no porque haya despertado, los cubanos hemos estado despiertos toda la vida, sino porque los cubanos, cantando No tenemos miedo, salieron a las calles de Cuba y del mundo a reclamar libertad, patria y vida. Y esos que nos están escuchando o que nos van a escuchar tienen que saber que no están solos, que el pueblo cubano que vive dentro de la isla no está solo, que el pueblo cubano que vive fuera de la isla jamás se va a cansar de luchar y que tenemos amigos en el mundo entero que están intentando mover ese mundo en favor de quienes son los protagonistas de su propia historia, que son los cubanos que están demandando libertad. Han sido 2 años de un antes y un después. La lucha continúa sobre todo honrando a quienes ya no están y a esos más de 1000 héroes que están en prisión en Cuba y que en su mayoría son héroes del 11 de julio. On July 11, 2021, as all of us know, the people of Cuba went into the streets by hundreds of thousands across the whole island, town by town, province by province, thanks to internet, by the way, and asked for libertad, patria y vida. That movement continues till today, but the answer of the Havana regime has been brutal. They took state terrorism to the next level, intensifying repression, killing and disappearance of peaceful protesters, forcing into exile or imprisoning thousands of Cubans. We just heard the atrocities that the more than 1,000 political prisoners that are in jail right now are enduring. There are more political prisoners in Cuba, by the way, than in the rest of the region all combined, that in the rest of the hemisphere all combined. That's the level of terror that the Cuban people is suffering right now. And we're here today and we are surrounded by friends and by members of Congress that have been championing the cause of freedom for Cuba, the cause of solidarity with the Cuban people. But being completely honest, the voices of the friends of Cuba, the voices of the members of Congress in the United States have been loud and persistent and systematic. But the answer to that, the consequence in the actions of the government of the United States, those have been absent. The Cuban people, not only in the case of this country, but the Cuban people, yes, we have a lot of friends. But when we talk about the actions of the governments and the international organisms, well, the reality is that we have been fighting virtually abandoned by the democratic world. And that reality is tragic. It's tragic because it means life and death for the Cuban people, but because the fact that the international community has tolerated for 64 years the Cuban regime in Cuba, well, that's the reason why now we also have to fight the Maduro regime in Nicaragua and the Ortega regime, the Maduro regime in Venezuela and the Ortega regime in Nicaragua. And that's the reason why we have experienced the democratic instability of our hemisphere for decades now. We just learned that it was not just one espionage base. No, the Chinese Communist Party has at least 4 bases to spy on this country, in my country. We have been seeing during the last almost 2 years, since the beginning of the invasion in Ukraine, how the Cuban regime has strengthened the military strategic alliance that they have with the Putin regime. The Russian ambassador in Havana went as far as saying that with the installment of the Mir platform payment, now they can circumvent the sanctions that this country and Europe has imposed over Russia with the support of the Cuban regime. The Cuban regime has been a permanent threat to the national security of this country and the whole continent. And as such, it should be treated. Just the last year, from November 2021 to December 2022, 367,000 Cubans were encountered in the southern border. We don't know how many has been lost trying to get there. We don't know how many lives have been lost in the sea in the same period, escaping for terror. But make no mistake, that was a very coordinated, reckless operation between the Havana regime and the Nicaragua regime, aiming to destabilize this country, aiming to release internal pressure because the Cuban people has been in the streets demanding freedom. And of course, also infiltrating Cuban communist agents into this country. That's the kind of beast that this country has 90 miles away. The good news? Well, the good news is that despite the oppression, the exodus, the violence, the state terrorism, and the hunger, because the Cuban people is starving, despite all this, the Cuban people is still fighting for freedom. More than 8,000 8,000 public protests were registered, has been registered since July 11, 2021 till today. That's a testimony of how hard we want freedom, of how far we're willing to get to obtain freedom. And that's an opportunity, as Congresswoman Maliotakis says, that's an opportunity to this country and the rest of the democratic world to extend the helping hand, not to the Cuban regime, but to the Cuban people. We at Cuba Decide propose a very logic roadmap to do so, mobilizing the Cuban people in and out the island, but also the international community, aiming one thing, to generate the kind of critical mass that forced that regime to submit to the will of the people and live as the Cuban people want and as the world desperately needs. That's how we follow up the legacy of my father, Oswaldo Payá, who mobilized thousands of Cubans, tens of thousands of them, demanding a democratic change in the system. He was murdered 11 years ago. Here in the audience, they are friends of my father. It took 10 years to the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights to finally publish a verdict holding accountable the Cuban regime for the killing of my father and my friend, Harold Cepero. Harold was younger than I when he was killed beside of my father. This took place last June, and only 2 days after that, the Senate of the United States unanimously passed a bill to rename the street in front of the Cuban dictatorship embassy that someday soon is going to be the embassy of the free Cubans, the embassy of the Cuban people. But today is the house of the delegates of the murders. And the US Senate passed a bill to rename that street after my father and call it Oswaldo Payá Way. His murders will have to say his name. His murders will have to say his name on the Oswaldo Payá Way. An identical bill is now sitting in the Oversight and Accountability Committee here in the House. So we encourage all the representatives of this House to pass that bill as soon as possible, because it is urgent. First, to send the Cuban people the message that we are not alone. And it's almost as important to send their murderers the message that they are not impugned, that the crimes against my father and Harold, but against all the victims, past and present, of the Cuban regime are not going to be impugned. Hopefully, we're going to see each other again on the Oswaldo Payá Way very soon. But I'm concerned. I'm concerned because I very much appreciate the statements that we have read and we have seen from the State Department and from the White House on the anniversary of the July 11, but we need actions. I'm concerned because when I saw the migratory talks, when I saw a delegation of the State Department landing in Havana to negotiate with those murderers, not to condition them, to negotiate, aiming to deport Cubans back to Cuba, those that have been escaping for terror, while there are more than 1,000 political prisoners in the island. When I saw in the Twitter profile of the US Embassy in Havana, collaborations with the Minister of Culture of the dictatorship, which is a repressive entity that should be sanctioned by the US. Well, that's starting to look a lot as appeasement. And we already know that that doesn't work. Dictatorships only answer to pressure. They fed on appeasement. They feed on appeasement. And that emboldens them. The day that the State Department delegation left the island, Díaz-Canel flew out to Argelia, Moscow, and Beijing. That's the amount of respect that they have for the negotiations. So I deeply believe in the good intentions of this country, the American people, and the American government. And I respectfully, once again, invite them and ask you, our friends in Congress, to encourage the executive branch to lead the democratic effort, the coalition of nations that is necessary to denounce the legitimacy of the Cuban regime that have never been elected by the Cuban people, and to pressure in the direction of a democratic change that the Cuban people are demanding. The US should vastly expand the use of individual and targeted sanctions to include all top Cuban regime officials and corrupt state administrators, as well as their family members that are part of the corruption, close associates, and foreign business partners. For instance, the US could make full use of the Global Magnitsky Act, targeting the murderers in power, targeting their networks of corruption. That's the way to support the Cuban people. That's the way to stop repression. That's the way to stop impunity. The US should recognize the Cuban pro-democracy movement. José Daniel Ferrer's face is in that wall. For months, we didn't know he was alive. That's the situation, and he's not the only one. Recognize the Cuban pro-democracy movement as the legitimate interlocutors of the Cuban people, and guarantee, the US should guarantee that any economic aid, commerce, or cooperation goes to the military, but should be directly delivered in the hands of the Cuban people. The US should provide uncensored internet access for the Cuban people. It's not that much to ask. This country and the world have done similar and even more big sins in support of democracy in the world. They do it. You did it for South Africa. You did it to help the Chilean people transit to democracy. Well, we Cubans, we are not less. And to defend democracy in Cuba is to defend it in the whole hemisphere. So we are here united. You have seen, you have listened to Tony, to Javier. We are going to listen from the Center for Free Cuba, from John Suarez, and from many others that should be here and couldn't because of several reasons. But we're here united because we are convinced that the way to stop the threat to the national security of the United States that the Cuban regime poses, the way to halt all these atrocities and human rights abuses, and the only way to guarantee a chance for democratic stability in the hemisphere is to pressure the Cuban regime for them to submit to the will of the people and leave. The Cuban regime is the Berlin Wall of our time. They are the Berlin Wall of the Americas. To turn that down, we need an international effort. And the United States is called to lead that effort. And that is to support the protagonist of this history, which is the Cuban people and their demand for freedom and democracy. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rosa Maria. We're going to turn now to Karina Lipsman from the Victims of Communism. You have time? You got to go?
I'll be 2 minutes. I will be 2 minutes to give you the floor. So good afternoon. Thank you so much for having us. I'm Karina Lipsman, the head of government relations for Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. While I am not Cuban, I did grow up, I was born and raised in Soviet Ukraine. So I very much understand everything that has been said today and know far too well what the Cubans are experiencing. So the promise of America, freedom, prosperity, equality for all, is what makes this country a destination for so many that are fleeing communist regimes. For my family and me, it was the assurance of not having someone knock down our door at 3 a.m. because of something that was said earlier that day. It was the ability to freely criticize our government without the fear of retribution. And it's the idea of someone like me, a minority immigrant, who came to this country not speaking the English language, growing up on food stamps and low-income housing in Baltimore City, being able to run for Congress last year, unsuccessfully, but now doing a very important mission at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation to commemorate those who have suffered under communism and preserving their memory, as well as fighting for those who are currently living under communist regimes around the world. So tragically, the oppression that I just spoke about, that I've experienced and my family, is no longer present since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall, but it's very much real on the island prison nation of Cuba. Cuba's communist regime has silenced the voices of millions who simply seek a brighter future. And in July of 2021, hundreds of thousands of Cubans took to the streets across the island to protest against the repression and corruption they have suffered for more than 6 decades. They demanded freedom, and they chanted, "Down with communism," singing Patria y Vida, or Fatherland and Life, a powerful message against the communist rule. The Cuban communist regime has responded further with repression and violence. More than 1,000 innocent Cubans are still held behind bars 2 years later. VOC, along with Prisoners Defenders and the Czech Transition Promotion Program, exposed Cuban's regime's brutal system of torture targeting democracy activists and political prisoners. The Torture in Cuba report is the most comprehensive examination of Havana's human rights crimes to date, analyzing 181 victims tortured by the regime in the last 12 months, utilizing both quantitative and qualitative methods. Among them, VOC's Truman Reagan Medal of Honor or Freedom Laureate, Jose Daniel Ferrer, artists such as Latin Grammy winners, Michael Castillo, AKA Asobro, and I apologize for the mispronunciation, and Luis Manuel Otero Alcantara, who were also recognized with VOC's Dissident Human Rights Awards and are being tortured in Cuba today. At VOC, we are dedicated to the remembrance of the more than 100 million victims of communism and to advocating for the freedom of those who are still suffering at the hands of communist regimes today. I thank you all for your support, and I encourage you to visit the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation if you haven't already. We're right off McPherson Square, 2 blocks from the White House, so we're not that far. um, and really support the mission that we are doing. There is an urgent need to support Cuban political prisoners, and we call upon the US government to pressure the Cuban regime to release them immediately rather than appeasing a brazen and communist regime hell-bent on oppressing, imprisoning, and torturing its own citizens. The legacy of the July 11th protests lives on. The Cuban people are no longer afraid. It's now our sacred moral duty to stand with them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Karina. And I would urge everyone to, especially the young folks here, they have a museum there at Victims of Communism that is very powerful, a testament to the human suffering that obviously took up so much of the 20th century and was the result of, was the cause of so much misery and death, and tremendous effort by the United States leading the West to seek the demise of communism and the Berlin Wall. And I remember the whole project began as a gleam in the eye of a friend, Lee Edwards. And to see that now his vision fulfilled, to have that memorial to the victims of communism is just extraordinary. For those of us who grew up in the Cold War, it was almost like, basically fighting for a free Cuba now. Those who thought they knew better felt like we could just charm them into changing their behavior. But as we know, the sources of the conduct of these regimes is not about accommodation or in the interest of accommodating the United States in any way. It's about power. And I think that, in wrapping up, it's very difficult for me to add anything to the words of what we've already heard, powerful words we've heard from our guest speakers. But I think that what we can take away from 2 years is that fear in Cuba is now on the other foot. The regime is terrified of the explosiveness of the Cuban people, and they know that they cannot perhaps survive the next time with just brute force. It's something that we all need to be continuing to be very vigilant and create the pressure on this regime so that they understand there's no way out, that repression is just not going to work. Hopefully, before too long, Congressman, you'll be able to revisit the land of your birth, as well as a lot of many other Cuban Americans who look fondly back. Obviously, it's part of people's identity, and million or so Americans, part of their core identity. And to see what's going on there while the world largely not only ignores it, but actually aids and abets this regime, it's simply intolerable. But that's not a reason to give up. It's a reason only to continue. And as the United States demonstrated, especially during the Reagan administration, that there could be an end if we only exerted the political will to achieve it. So with that, thank you all for attending today. The live broadcast on the internet has been underway, and I'm sure the Cuban people are going to hear your message in Spanish, Rosa Maria. And if not, we'll make sure that those words are heard in Cuba. But thank you again and thank you for our speakers. Thank you for the members who came, and we'll just keep fighting. Thank you, everybody.